It's been more than 20 years since human trafficking was designated as a federal crime in the U.S. Now, a new report is offering a look at how the government has worked to prosecute these heinous crimes over the past 2 decades. Victor Boutros is the CEO of the Human Trafficking Institute, the group behind the report, and he joins me now to talk about the findings. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. What does this year's report tell us about who human trafficking victims are and how these victims are being coerced?
Well, good morning. It's great to be with you. This report actually looks at the last 20 years of trends in the federal government. What we've learned about victims is that they are overwhelmingly women and children. So 50% of the victims are children, and a large majority are women. So 44% are women, 50% are girls, 44% are women. And traffickers often prey on existing vulnerabilities of victims, ranging from substance dependency to runaways from home to homelessness and foster care. So they're actually looking for existing vulnerabilities that they prey on to make money.
I think that there's maybe some misconceptions about the victims and the trafficker that we need to sort of talk a little bit about. When I was looking at the numbers, something struck me. We've recently been having a big conversation about traffickers coming from, south of the border and getting people across the border. But one of the things that the report sort of points out is that everyone's affected, even people who live right here. And I thought it was really interesting when it came to the prosecutions that the numbers of victims and the numbers of traffickers convicted, or rather not convicted, but sort of arrested, are almost sort of close. There are a handful of more victims, like maybe several hundred more victims. But I thought to myself, I wonder if when we think of traffickers, we're thinking of one individual that might organize a group, 6 or 7 people. But I wonder if in many cases it's kind of like a one-on-one situation, one trafficker with one victim.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we imagine that traffickers are these large criminal syndicates or networks that are exploiting a huge number of victims. But actually, most traffickers are not operating as an organized crime enterprise. It's mostly individual traffickers that are operating individually and often exploiting a small handful of victims at a time. So there's a large number of them, victims that are exploited, but they're often exploited by an individual trafficker working on his or her own. And so that is a misconception that we see. The other thing that you referenced that's also true, that's often a misconception, is we often think of trafficking involving victims from foreign countries, and really only 13% of victims are foreign nationals. Most of the conduct that we see and most of the conduct that's prosecuted at the federal level takes place in the United States. In fact, most of it doesn't even involve the crossing of a state border. So most of these cases are happening intrastate, inside state borders. So I think those are 2 common misconceptions that we often picture in our mind that this report surprisingly shows are not true.
Also, when we talk about trafficking, often we talk about sex trafficking. I was also sort of surprised to see that a significant number of people are trafficked into doing domestic work, forced to work in households and not being able to leave. And the report talks about the role of the internet when it comes to human trafficking. Can you talk a little bit about that, how the internet is being used to recruit people?
Absolutely. That's one of the largest trends that we see over the last 20 years is the internet has become the dominant tool that traffickers use to recruit victims. And they often recruit them on a number of very common social networking websites. Facebook overwhelmingly is used by traffickers to recruit victims in active sex trafficking cases. They're by far the largest platform cited in the cases that we looked at. 59% of those cases involved recruitment from Facebook. Instagram was next with 13%. And then WeChat with 9% and Snapchat at 7%. So this is becoming the dominant tool that traffickers are using to recruit victims, as reflected in the case data that we see.
We mentioned that it's been more than 20 years since human trafficking was designated as a federal crime. What trends have we seen over that time in how human trafficking crimes are prosecuted in the U.S.?
Well, I think this is another maybe surprising insight that comes from the poor report. I think trafficking can seem like this massive, dark, enterprise that there's nothing that we can do about. And what we've seen in the last 20 years is just really significant growth in prosecutions. So, in fact, in the last decade, we've seen 3.5 times the prosecutions that we saw in the first decade of this work. So we are seeing an upward trend in enforcement and holding traffickers accountable, and that's very encouraging to see. The other big thing that we see is that it's not about movement or crossing borders. The crime is ultimately about coercion. And so we have to move away from the idea that this is mostly foreign nationals being moved across borders. And then the rise of online solicitation is also a big theme. So not only are traffickers recruiting online, but they're also connecting with purchasers of commercial sex online. So online platforms have really moved up the chain overwhelmingly over the last 20 years as method that traffickers use not only to recruit victims, but to solicit customers.
This is all really, really important information. I mean, you never know when you might be looking at something on Facebook that is a recruitment tactic, or when you might be, interacting with someone in the grocery store who's actually a victim of being trafficked, unless you have an idea that these victims sort of run the gamut, and it's not sort of necessarily the stereotypes that you're used to. Victor Boutros, thanks a lot. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Great to be with you.